So just before Lisa Allen leaves the Post Office Horizon IT inquiry, after she's finished the testimony, there's some questions from core participants, and in particular the lawyer that's represented Suzanne Palmer, who's one of the case study cases that has been discussed extensively with Lisa Allen. And it's put to her that she ran an inadequate investigation, but she strongly refutes this allegation, and it does lead to a hypothetical question being asked of her, and the chairman is forced to intervene. Let's jump into the inquiry.
I think Mr. Jacob has questions, sir.
Yeah. Thank you, sir. Miss Allen, I appear for 156 sub-postmasters, all of whom have fallen foul of the Post Office in relation to the Horizon system, and one of whom is Suzanne Palmer, who sits to my left, who you investigated, and we're dealing with that in your evidence this morning. Now, this morning you accepted 4 things. You accepted where sub-postmasters allege that shortfalls are due to problems with Horizon, a reasonable line of inquiry would be to seek audit data to explore whether that data might support what the sub-postmaster says, and you agreed. That was right. You also accepted and acknowledged when Ms. Price took you through the interview that Ms. Palmer raised Horizon integrity issues at her interview.
Yes, she raised issues with the Horizon system.
You requested no data from Fujitsu. You requested no data to check the integrity of the Horizon terminal at her branch. That's right, isn't it?
Yes.
And you omitted to mention the matter in your investigation report.
It wasn't in the report, but it was in the tape transcript that was provided.
Yeah, but it wasn't in your report.
No, it wasn't in my report.
And your investigation was inadequate, wasn't it? Do you accept that now?
It was inadequate?
Yes.
No, I don't accept
Well,
that.
it was inadequate because you failed to act in accordance with your duty as an investigator to conduct reasonable lines of inquiry. Surely you must accept that.
There probably were more reasonable lines of inquiry I could have made, but I think I made the reasonable lines of inquiries for the case at that time.
Well,
hindsight is a wonderful thing.
Don't want to go around in circles, but you've accepted that where a sub-postmaster or mistress alleges shortfalls in the Horizon system, it is a reasonable line of inquiry to request data to support what the sub-postmaster is saying, and you didn't do that, and you didn't refer to it in your report. So you didn't carry through reasonable lines of inquiry in this investigation. Those inquiries you did not undertake.
In this investigation, it wasn't a cash loss. This investigation was related to scratch cards, error notices, and money placed into a private ATM machine.
And I guess here, the point to kind of highlight, and it's very hard, isn't it? And I appreciate this, it's very hard to reflect on one's own actions and sometimes be very critical. But there's 2 things here that Lisa Allen's accepting. Firstly, that there were more reasonable lines of investigation that could have been looked into. That's not saying she didn't look into any. That's saying she acknowledges, at least with the benefit of hindsight, that actually there were more reasonable lines of inquiry. And I guess it comes down to what we're classing as an adequate investigation, and where there are so many potential life-changing consequences for people, the standard for that needs to be set at a high bar. And if the Post Office's standard was that, at least in theory, all reasonable lines of inquiry were to be explored, then that would suggest that in the view of the Post Office's policy, that a adequate investigation was one that explored all reasonable lines of inquiry. Therefore, you would think it would be acceptable to conclude that under the admission that these weren't all explored, that it does actually mean that the investigation itself was inadequate.
The jury didn't accept that, did they?
They didn't, no.
And it's to be frank, my client finds it extraordinary that you do not remember attending her trial. You were there for 3 days. You gave evidence at her trial. You were there, as Ms. Price has said, when the jury asked a question, what is Mrs. Palmer supposed to do if she doesn't agree with the Horizon system? You and the legal team were floundering, you couldn't answer that question, and the jury acquitted my client in between 10 and 35 minutes. Surely you must remember that.
I remember going to Southend Crown Court, but I don't actually remember the trial.
Do you remember that there was a petition with 600 signatures attesting to Mrs. Palmer's good character presented at the hearing?
I've read about it in documents.
I mean, one of the things here, which would be why you would think it would be more memorable, I mean, if you go into court a number of times as part of your role, maybe they're not all memorable, but the fact of the jury coming back so swiftly with a not guilty verdict, you would think would make it more memorable.
Are you aware that Post Office put pressure on Mrs. Palmer's assistant not to give evidence to support her case because they said they might investigate her? Are you aware of anything surrounding that?
I've seen that in a document, but I was not aware of that at all, no.
I mean, if that is true, that would be absolutely outrageous behaviour on behalf of the Post Office. There would be no getting away from that. People would know that was wrong now and wrong at the time.
Do you remember, between the audit and Mrs. Palmer's interview with you, going to her shop, having an interview with her in her stockroom because she wasn't allowed into her post office, having a meeting with her, and telling her that if she paid the money back, the post office probably wouldn't prosecute?
No, I don't, but I believe at that time she'd already written a cheque and gave it to the auditors, possibly. But I wouldn't have said that because that's not a decision that I make.
Well, you said in your view, you believed that if she paid the money back, the post office probably wouldn't prosecute.
I wouldn't say that because it's not my decision to make.
And she was worried that her cheque might bounce, and so she came to the interview with you and Mr. Chine with £9,000 in a bag. Do you remember that?
I do recall her having some money with her, yes.
And do you remember, 3 months after the interview, phoning her up and saying, "Oh, Mrs. Palmer, not good news for you, they're going to prosecute you"? Do you recall using those words?
I don't know.
Mrs. Palmer recalls that very well. Do you accept that that would not have been an appropriate or professional way to behave?
That would have been callous if those words were used, let's be honest.
I don't think I would have said it the way you've put it. No.
Do you accept an investigator saying those words would not have been appropriate and would not have been professional?
No, it wouldn't have been professional.
Mrs. Palmer was acquitted. She was completely vindicated. We understand that there was no review into her case, notwithstanding that the Post Office position of Horizon being robust was thoroughly disbelieved by the jury. She wasn't reinstated. She was bankrupt until 2016. This effectively has ruined her life. Do you accept, as the investigator, that you have some role to play in what happened to her and some responsibility?
I didn't make any decisions regarding prosecution. I presented the case and the decision to prosecute was on the legal advice and the designated prosecution authority.
So no regret whatsoever from you, no?
I'm sorry that Mrs. Palmer found herself in that position, yes. But the decision to prosecute was not mine.
Do you think the decision to prosecute might have been a different decision if you had pursued the appropriate lines of inquiry and mentioned the issues that Mrs. Palmer raised with the Horizon system in your report?
We allow hypotheticals, but I think that's pushing it a bit too far, Mr. Jacobs.
So, yes, I'll ask if I have any more questions. I don't have anything else to add. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else?
So that appears to be all the further questions that there are.
Thank you. Well, first of all, I hope that Mrs. Palmer has found this morning's session informative. Secondly, I'd like to thank you, Ms. Allen, for making a witness statement and answering all the questions put to you this morning. You'll all be glad to hear that I don't propose to deliver an end-of-term report, so to speak. But there are two things that I'd like to say publicly before we break for the holiday. The first is that I would like to pay tribute to all members of the inquiry team, that is, barristers, solicitors, paralegals, trainee solicitors, and anyone else who is not encompassed by those 4 categories, for the huge amount of work they have done over the last year to facilitate the smooth running of the inquiry. That public admiration applies with equal force to every member of the Secretariat in whatever role they have played. No chairman could be more satisfied with the support he receives from his inquiry team. So that's a public tribute to you all. I would also like to thank all the core participants and their representatives. To say that there have not been the occasional hiccup, for example, in relation to disclosure, would be to go too far. But I do wish to thank all the core participants and their representatives for the efficient way in which they conduct their part in this inquiry. For various reasons, there has been a need for a great deal of flexibility, and all the core participants and their representatives have demonstrated willingness to act flexibly to help me. For the help that I have received from you all, I give you considerable thanks. It only remains for me to wish you a happy holiday, and I hope you celebrate this period in the way in which you all feel most appropriate. I know that I'm going to celebrate it in the way that I feel appropriate, but I'm not going to declare publicly how that is. So thank you all very much. And I'll see you on January the 11th. Is that correct, Ms. Price?
Yes, sir, it is. Stephen Bradshaw on the 11th of January.
Yeah. All right then.